everyone! Today we're going to continue with the sewing of our dress by moving on to the collar and facing. Let's get started. For this portion of the project, you should have cut out 2 front facings, 2 inner facings that correspond with your front facing, 1 top collar, 1 under collar, and inner facing that corresponds with your top collar, as well as your completed princess bodice from the last portion of the tutorial. We're going to begin by fusing our inner facing onto its corresponding fabric pieces. To fuse our inner facing, we want to make sure we start with a nice hot iron, and we'll want to begin by grabbing our top collar and our inner facing. The top collar is identified by being the one with the single notch along the center back neckline. Your under collar has a double notch along the center back neckline, but our inner facing was made to fit the top collar. So let's set our under collar aside. Feel on your inner facing and find the kind of bumpy textured side. That's the side that's fusible, meaning it has the glue that will help adhere it onto your fabric. So we want to find that bumpy side and then place it against the wrong side of your fabric. Try to center the inner facing on the fabric as best as you can. Our inner facing was drafted to be 1/8 of an inch smaller around all sides, so you want to be sure that you see a nice even offset everywhere. Rather than taking your iron and immediately swiping it back and forth, you're going to shove that inner facing around and it may not sit exactly how we want it to. So it's always better to kind of first start by doing a press and hold for a couple seconds and work your way down. You may see that your fabric starts to curl. Not a huge problem at the moment. Okay, now that we've kind of started that fusing process, we can go back and run our iron down the length of the piece. And then it's nice to flip it over and also press it from the fabric side so that you get rid of any little bubbles that happen along the way. You should end up with both the inner facing and the fabric nicely fused together and acting as one piece of fabric. After you've fused your top collar, you'll want to repeat the same process for your front facings. When a collar is drafted, the 2 pieces of fabric that form up the collar, which are the top collar and the under collar, are not created to be the exact same size. The under collar is always created a slight amount smaller than the top collar. This is what allows the collar to roll over properly and not have the seam along the collar edge be flipping out or overly visible when the garment is being worn. So when we go to sew our collar together, we need to make sure that we position both pieces properly so that that offset that happens in the drafting stage also continues through when the garment is being sewn. You're going to start by taking your top collar and positioning it with the right side of the fabric facing up. Once we've fused inner facing onto a pattern piece, that becomes the wrong side of the piece. So I'm going to flip mine over so the inner facing is down. Now my right side is facing up. Take your under collar and put it with the right side facing down onto your top collar. As we're doing our pinning, we're going to be pinning and sewing these 3 outer edges of the 2 collar pieces together. We will not be pinning and sewing along the neckline edge here, which is the one that has all of the notches. Because our under collar was drafted slightly smaller than the top collar, we have to really pull those edges to fit so that the offset we created continues through to the sewing process. We want to begin by pinning any of our corners first, as well as any notches, which will be this one right in the center of the collar edge. And then we'll continue to split up those spaces halfway until our collar is thoroughly pinned and ready to sew. So I'll start with this pointier corner over here. Really bring those edges together. And I'm going to pin diagonally at my corners. Same thing over on this side. Then we'll do the same thing with these lower corners. You can already see it's being a little bit finicky because that undercolor is smaller. So whatever it takes, you want to be pulling those edges together. And the excess fabric of the top collar will ease into place as we sew it. After the corners are pinned, let's move on to our notch. So make sure the notches of both layers are nicely aligned and pin. Now let's go halfway between these points. And you may even want to sort of gently stretch the fabric between sections so that the ease gets evenly distributed along the way. Let's go halfway on these diagonal edges here. These are on the bias, so you can really kind of pull them as well in your pinning to make sure that the ease is evenly split up. Okay, maybe let's go halfway one more time between these larger spaces here. It will really make sewing a lot easier if your collar is thoroughly pinned. Now that the outer edges of the collars are pinned, we can see that 1/8 of an inch offset happening along the neckline edge, and that's exactly what we want. We're now ready to sew our collar. We're going to be going around the 3 collar edges, sewing at 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. We'll backstitch at both ends, and we'll nicely pivot at the outer corners. We're going to be stitching all the way around the collar edge that we pinned with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back stitching at the beginning and the end. So start with your little back stitch, then come forward. Really make sure that you've pulled the edges that you're currently sewing together. Now as we get close to the corner here where we're going to need to pivot, one thing to know is you don't want to sew all the way to the bottom edge of the fabric. We want to stop with the needle down 1/4 of an inch short of that, and that will be our perfect pivot point. What will help us do this is actually lowering your stitch length a little bit as you're creeping towards that corner. That way you can really kind of fine tune where you stop and be sure that you pivot at the correct point. So I'm going to lower my stitch length to maybe about 1.5 millimeters or so. For most of your standard sewing, you should be at 2.5 millimeters. So I want to come up to my corner here, 1 stitch at a time, and I want to stop 1/4 of an inch from the edge. See it taking little baby stitches? Okay. And be sure you end with your needle down in the fabric. Mine is programmed to stop with the needle always down, but if yours is not capable of doing that, then just turn the hand wheel and make sure you have the needle lowered in the fabric before you attempt to pivot. Then you raise the foot, rotate your fabric, and we'll continue forward. Before we continue sewing forward, see how the fabric is naturally sitting with the edges not aligned here? We want to really make sure they are aligned when we sew. That's the undercollar being smaller and pulling itself away a little bit. So if you need to, you can reach inside and pull the top collar over a little bit with your fingertip as you continue sewing. Okay, I'm still on my tiny stitch now, which is actually really kind of nice for coming out of the corner as well. It will reinforce it quite a bit when we ultimately clip that corner and turn it outwards. But after I've come 2 or 3 stitches, I'm going to go back to my normal stitch length. And again, pulling those edges to meet, I'm going to continue forward with 1/4 inch. We're going to clip some excess fabric away from these corners so that as we turn them outwards, we can have them be nice and sharp. So grab your fabric shears, come to your first corner, and you want to look at where your stitches are at the corner. Cut that excess fabric off to within about maybe a 1/16 of an inch from the stitching line at the corner. And then in addition to that clip, we want to remove even a little bit more excess. So from where the corner is, I'm going to sort of taper a little bit more off on either side of it, like that. Tapering the corner like this will remove even more of that bulky excess and will give us a nice clean corner in the end. So let's do the same thing over here. Understitching is the process of stitching a seam allowance onto whichever side of the seam ends up on the inside of the garment. This helps gives a sharper, cleaner finish on the edge, as well as keeps that seam from rolling back to the outside. So in the case of our collar, we're going to be stitching the seam allowance onto the under collar. To help us do that, we want to first press that seam allowance towards the under collar. So it's in its inside out position. I'm going to come to the inside of my collar, pull it open, and I'm using the tailor's ham again to help me in this process. I want to spread both sides of my collar open, and I want to be sure that underneath my seam allowance is going towards the under collar, which is the side of the collar that does not have your fusible interfacing onto it, and is also indicated by the double notch along the neckline here. So check underneath, really pull this open, and ensure that your seam allowance is going towards under collar. Then take your iron and just press it in that direction. Really be sure that you're pulling that seam open so that you don't catch an extra fold of fabric in there. Now granted, you won't be able to get all the way up to the corners, but get in there as much as you can. The same will be true when we do our sewing of the understitch. You won't be able to get all the way into the corners, but we want to get the main majority length of the seam. Once your seam allowance has been pressed towards the undercollar, now we can do our understitching at the sewing machine. To do our understitching, we'll want to be edge stitching about 1/16 of an inch over from our seam so that we are stitching the seam allowance to the undercollar. I have it positioned right in the center of the seam just so I could show you that placement, but you will want to begin and end this as far as possible into either ends of your collar. So I'm going to come all the way back here, and I know it's a tight squeeze, but pull that forward as much as you can. You'll reasonably be able to start sewing probably about an inch or so from that corner, but make sure your seam is really pulled open. And then now we can be positioned and ready to go. I'm going to start by sewing backwards, just 2 or 3 stitches to secure it. And now I want to really spread it open and come forward with my understitch. I'm just using the inner edge of my presser foot as a guide. It gives me a really nice understitching placement. So depending on the shape and size of your presser foot, that technique may be the same for you. So when completed, the spacing of your edge stitching should look something like this. So at this point, you want to take your collar and turn it right side out. First, just use your fingertips to kind of push that excess outwards towards the corners, but ultimately we're going to want to use some tools to pop it out even more. To help me push some excess fabric outward at the corners, I'm going to use a tool called a point turner. Its sole purpose is literally to help you turn points. And then to really refine that corner even more, you can use a pin and very gently and carefully use it to poke and pull a little bit more fabric to drag it out at the corners. Next, we want to press our collar. I'm going to use the ham again, and first just press over the top of that outer collar edge seam that we just understitched. Next, you'll want to position your collar with the under collar facing up. And what I want to do here is pull the neckline edge of the under collar down to meet the neckline edge of the top collar now. And while I have those pulled into place, we should see, once we go to press, that your understitching, as well as a little bit of the top collar, is rolling around towards the under collar side. That was the whole purpose of us drafting and sewing this collar the way that we did, okay? So again, you just want to pull the bottom edges to meet. And while those are matched up, now I can go over the collar with my iron. Okay. On the side edges here, just make sure your seam is nicely at the edge as you press. So now I'm going to go to this half, pull those neckline edges together, and press over the top of the collar. Okay. Okay. Now that my collar is pressed, I should really see this little 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch lip here of the top collar rolling around towards the under collar side. You'll also want to take your collar, flip it over, and give it a nice press from the top collar side as well. Once your collar is completed, you can set it aside and you'll want to grab your already sewn princess line bodice as well as your 2 front facings with the inner facings already attached. We're going to be stitching our front facings onto the front edge and neckline of our bodice. So I'll start by pushing one of the facings aside. And you'll want to begin by placing the right side of your facing, which is the side that does not have the inner facing, against the right side of your bodice on the side that it corresponds to. So that means I'm going to place my facing right on here, and we'll be pinning along our front edge as well as partially onto the neckline. It helps if I kind of pull the rest of the bodice away. So now I can really kind of isolate and work on this section. So nicely match up the front edge here. And you'll want to first pin at the bottom of the facing and then move all the way up here to the top corner and pin. Make sure everything's sitting nice and smooth. And then next you'll pin in the middle, in the middle of these two, and in the middle of these two. And then lastly, we're not going to be stitching all the way up the neckline in this particular step, but we are going to pivot at this corner here and stitch just over until our notch, which indicates the exact center front of the garment. So I'm going to pin right there as well. Now let's go ahead and pin the other side the same way. We're going to be stitching at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We'll backstitch at the beginning as well as at the end, which is right at our center front notch on the neckline. Start a little ways down from the beginning so that you can go in reverse first to the top edge and then go right on down. Okay, so as I'm coming up to the corner here, just like we did on the collar, it really helps if I reduce my stitch length a little bit so I could get my pivoting point really precise. Just creep on up and be sure you stop with the needle down a 1/4 inch from the edge. And while the needle is down, raise the presser foot, rotate your garment, lower it, and continue. And I go back to my regular stitch length after I'm kind of out of the corner. Now as we're coming up to our notch here where we want to finish, this little notch that indicates the center front, we want to be extremely precise with having our back stitch begin right at that point. We really don't want to sew beyond it or stop short of it. So I'm going to come right up to the point where my needle is at that notch and backstitch precisely from that location. If we go too far or not far enough, then we end up with problems in attaching our collar. So when you're completed, your stitches should end and be reinforced exactly where that notch is. Then you can go ahead and repeat the same thing for the other side. After your facings have been sewn onto your bodice, we'll want to understitch those front edges the same way we did on our collar. This will ensure that we have a nice, clean, sharp finish along the front edges of the garment. So before we do the actual understitching, we'll want to press our seam allowances in the appropriate direction. Since understitching involves pressing and stitching the seam allowance towards the part of the garment that will finish on the inside, you'll want to open up your seam from the right side and feel that your seam allowance of the seam that you just sewed is going towards the facing rather than towards the bodice, okay? So we want to feel from underneath and pull that seam allowance over in this direction and then press. Although, just like the collars, we're coming up to that little point that we made at the top as we pivoted onto the neckline. So you're gonna have the same situation where you won't be able to press or stitch all the way up into that corner. It's gonna get a little tight. So just go up as far as you reasonably can. So this one will face the opposite direction. That means my seam allowance is going to go this way, towards the facing, not towards the bodice. We're going to be understitching our seam using the same edge stitch spacing that we did on our collar. So that means we're going to want to be stitching about a 1/16 of an inch away from our seam here on the side of it that contains the seam allowance. Start with a little back stitch. And really be sure that you're pulling that seam open as you go. Here we are coming up to our corner at the top. So remember, you won't be able to get all the way up to the tippy top, but just get as close as you can. Really pull all that extra fabric open and get as far as you can without sewing over a fold. And finish by going in reverse for just a couple stitches. Then you repeat the same thing for the other side. After your understitching has been completed, we can begin to attach the collar to the bodice. First off though, we want to do a little mark and then clip that will help us out in that process. Here's my collar with the top collar side facing up. I want to come to where my shoulder notches are here, and I want to mark exactly 1/4 of an inch inward from the edge as an indication line for where I'm going to clip the fabric. Your fabric is already slightly clipped from when you did your cutting, but we want to make sure that that clip goes exactly 1/4 of an inch deep. So it does help to bring out the ruler and mark it. So I'm just drawing a little guideline, 1/4 of an inch long from each notch. And then I'll take my fabric shears and just on the top collar layer, not the under collar, I want to cut the fabric exactly to that 1/4 inch depth on my shoulder notches. Next, we'll bring in our bodice. Have your bodice positioned inside out, just like this, so that when I pull it open, I'm looking at the back with the right side facing up. Then you will take your collar, still with the top collar positioned up as well, but you want to pull it open and pin the right side of your under collar, which has the double notches, to the right side of your neckline up here. So ultimately, we're matching double notch to double notch and pinning the collar to the neckline first, but only the under collar layer. Next, you want to look at these outer notches here and pin them exactly to your shoulder seams. So match the notch to the seam. Be sure your seam allowance underneath for the shoulder seam is still pressed open, both throughout your pinning as well as your sewing. So pin the notch to the shoulder seam and do the same thing on the other side. Okay, and then let's go ahead and add one more pin in the middle of each of these spaces. Make sure your edges are nicely pulled together between the collar and the neckline. After we're finished with this section, you're going to continue pinning the sides of the collar to the front neckline. So on this side here, before I just kind of walk my pins from the shoulder seam towards the end here, we want to pin the edge of the collar here to right here. This is where you had that notch at the center front on the neckline, and that is exactly the point where you want to match up the end of your collar in your pinning. But this time, for the section of the collar that is going along the front neckline, we're not pulling the collar open and pinning only the under collar. We're going to be pinning both layers of the collar to the neckline, from the shoulder seams outward. So that means I could just leave the collar exactly like this with both layers together and really shove the edge of it right into that nook created by the end of your seam line. Then come in between here, pin once more in the middle, and then let's go in the middle of those sections again. Okay, and now we'll repeat the same thing on the other side. Once we're at this stage right here, we're actually going to sort of adjust and repin these sections. It really helped us out to first just pin the collar itself to the neckline, but ultimately what we're going to be doing for these outer sections of the collar is taking our facing and folding it back over the top of the collar and repinning it in place so that our entire collar is sandwiched between the bodice and the facing. So I would recommend first coming to the end of your facing at your shoulder seam here, matching the notch with your shoulder notch. So match up all the notches and the shoulder seam. And then, while everything is together, you're going to remove the pin that's in that position and repin through all the layers, okay? And now we'll continue making that same adjustment through the rest of this front neckline section. So really kind of pull this open, make sure it's spread out nice and evenly. And in this middle section here, once you have your edges together, just pull it out and put it right back in, but through everything, including the facing. Same thing over here. And even this one that's holding the end of the collar in place, we'll do the same thing, but be sure the end of the collar does not slip downwards. It will tend to try to escape inside. So really make sure it's pulled upwards and all your edges of everything are together here as you repin the end of the collar. And let's fix this one last pin. Okay. And now we can repeat the same thing on the other side. Once you've finished with all that, the The portions of your collar from the shoulder seam to the center front should be completely sandwiched between the bodice and the facing with all the layers pinned together. Before we go to sew, the reason that we created that little clip on our top collar before we started pinning was so that for the center section of the collar here, which is what runs along the back neckline, we don't want to include the top collar in our sewing. So that clip on either sides of the shoulder allows us to take the top collar and kind of fold it inward to get it out of the way. So right here where your clip is, tuck the excess downward so that when we sew past this point, we don't catch any of the top collar in our seam, okay? So I'm gonna take it and just cleanly tuck it inward from the point at which our clip ends. If it helps you, you could even come to the center here and where that excess is folded inward, just kind of pin it in place like that. Because ultimately what we'll be doing with this seam now is sewing from one end to the other. And as we come across this center section here along the back neckline, we don't want the top collar to be included in our seam. We should be able to cleanly come across and go from sewing on all layers to sewing on everything except the top collar and then back to all layers. We're going to be sewing our neckline with 1/4 inch seam allowance. Because we already have this first inch sewn up to our notch at the center front, we can actually just kind of overlap those stitches by starting a little ways before they end and not have to backstitch. So right about here is a good place to begin, and I want to make sure that I'm on my 1/4 inch line as well as right on top of those previous stitches. And we're off. You definitely want to take this seam nice and slow. Give it a lot of care. There's a lot of different stuff going on, a lot of layers, a lot of, potential to sew over a fold or have things go wrong. So really take your time with this. Always be checking what's going on underneath as well. Maybe grab your bodice and pull it off to the side so that extra fabric doesn't creep in underneath where you're trying to sew. Okay, so I'm coming up on the shoulder area here, and there's a few things that need to happen at this point. One, right here where you have the edge of your shoulder seam, this is seam allowance, and right where our notch is, you want to actually fold the seam allowance back, as well as checking underneath where that little clip we made is and being sure that our seam allowance from our top collar is nicely tucked underneath and out of our way from that point. So then I can lay this right over the top with the shoulder seam allowance folded back and sew over it exactly in this position. And once you're past that point, you should no longer be stitching on the top collar. It should be completely out of the way. And now we're only attaching the under collar to the back neckline for this section. So right here, we're coming up on the other shoulder seam, and we want to do the exact same thing we did with the first one. It's just facing opposite directions. So I'm going to take this 1/2 inch of seam allowance, and right where my notch is, I'm going to fold it towards me, as well as checking on the seam allowance of the top collar and being sure that it's tucked cleanly off to the side where our clip ends. And so right here, I want to hit that intersection of all the little folds as I transition onto the front section of the neckline, as well as the facing. Just overlap the stitches you already have by a few, and we're good. After your neckline seam is completed, you really want to check out your work thoroughly and be sure that you didn't sew over any weird little folds or odd spots. So you'll want to lift up your collar and check it out to see where the collar meets the bodice. And give it a thorough examination along the length of the whole seam here to be sure that there aren't any unnecessary folds picked up along the way. Once you've confirmed that that's all good to go, you're ready to move on to the final stage of sewing the collar. Before we sewed the collar on, we did a little clip exactly 1/4 inch deep on the top collar only so that we could fold it out of the way. So what we're gonna do now is come to those notches and clip through the same spot, but now through all the layers of fabric that are in this spot. So that means you'll be clipping through the under collar and the bodice at the shoulder seam as well. So I'm gonna take my scissors here, and you're clipping exactly 1/4 inch deep right up to your stitch line here. Do that on both sides. We did this because ultimately the seam allowance on the front sections of the collar are going to be going in an opposite direction from the seam allowances that are on the back section of the collar. So doing that little clip allows us to flip our seam allowances in opposite directions. And that's what we're going to do right now. Your top collar should still be excluded from the seam that you just sewed. But we want to start by coming to the right side of the garment here where the under collar meets the bodice. And for this back neck section, we want to press this seam allowance upwards and into the collar. If we were to look at the garment from this side, that means we're taking this section of the seam and pushing it towards the collar. But we get a much better press if we do that from the right side. That allows you to get the iron nice and deep into that seam. So make sure top collar is still out of the picture. And between the two shoulder seams along the back neck, give a nice press to that seam with the seam allowance going into the collar. So now if we look from this side, we can see it's now going upwards and towards the collar. We want to take our top collar now, grab the edge, and fold exactly that 1/4 inch seam allowance under so that we're tucking it to the inside. Ultimately, imagine that all your seam allowances from both the seam of the under collar and the bodice, as well as the seam allowance of the top collar, those are all going into the collar to finish. So as I tuck that under, my fold that I'm creating on the top collar should come exactly to cover my stitch line right here. So have that fold right on top of your stitches, not too far beyond, nor do you want to have a lot of visibility of the stitches either. You want it to be right on them. And then you want to pin it in place. So it helps to put your pins right into that little fold that you just created and pin. And we're going to continue pinning that same way all the way out to the corners. And as you get out towards your shoulder seams here, this is where that little clip you did is going to come in handy, because that allows everything to tuck under nice and clean from that corner point. Put a pin right there. Okay, and now we'll do the same thing, continuing outwards to the other shoulder seam. Now that we've pinned the final section of our collar, we can take it over to the sewing machine and we'll be doing an edge stitch along this section where we folded our seam allowance up inside. So that means we'll be sewing about 1/16 of an inch above the fold on all the layers of the collar and seam allowances. And we'll do a nice precise little back stitch at the beginning and end, right where it meets your folded back shoulder seam allowance. So we're gonna bring it over right about here, and I want to be sewing about 1/16 of an inch above the fold here, okay? And we want to have a back stitch at both ends that does its kind of turnaround, like it's exchange from backwards to forwards, exactly at the folded back edge of your shoulder seam. That means I want to start a little ways after the shoulder seam and go backwards to it to begin. Okay, so go backwards exactly to that folded over shoulder seam and then come forward. And as we finish now, you want to come right up to the shoulder seam and then go in reverse to finish. Your completed collar, when looked up from the inside, should look exactly like so. Here's our edge stitching. Here's that seam allowance from our shoulder seams folded backwards. We have quite a bit of pressing and cleanup to do though before we say that we've completed this whole process. So let's come to our corners that are out here, right? This is our center front corner where we attached our facing. We want to give it the same corner clipping treatment that we did on the corners of the collar. So you want to come right to that corner and snip it diagonally across, almost at your stitch line, and then maybe even taper off a little more to either side. We also want to release a little bit of tension along the curve of the neckline here, especially at the front. So along your neckline seam, where we have this deep curve of the neck happening, do a couple little clips almost to the seam line. Not too many though, about 3 is fine, so don't go wild with it. That'll help the neckline sit a little more smoothly. Next, you're going to take the whole garment and it'll be time to flip it right side out. We want to get up inside those corners we just clipped with a point turner or other appropriate tool and just pop those out so they look like a nice, cute little right angle. Okay. Another good technique to do on corners that you're turning is to pinch them crossways and give the fabric a little bit of a roll. That helps to almost drag out a little bit more. See that now? Same thing on the other side. Now that we've done those, we can begin our pressing. We have a few things to focus on here. First off, come to those shoulder seam allowances on your facing. We already folded them back at a 1/2 inch, but we want to kind of continue that fold out all the way to the end and press it in place. Next, let's press along our neckline here. So right where our facing is attached, see how it keeps wanting to flap upwards? You want to bring it down and make sure on the other side that your bodice is also pulled down and away from the collar. And we want to press that seam from both sides. So I find it helps when we're doing this to stretch it so that the facing and the bodice lay flat on your pressing surface and then the collar sort of sticks upwards. This is what helps you avoid having any weird ugly folds in places you don't want. So see that smooth here? Collar kind of pops upwards and then we can press along the seam. Same thing on the other side. And those portions that we just pressed, we now want to flip it over and really check and press the other side as well, which is the right side of our bodice. See, it's very easy for a lot of folds to still get caught up in that as you're pressing. If you can hear, the hissing dragon, I'm choosing to start using a little bit of steam in the pressing process now too. We were just doing dry pressing before, but if you have some stubborn areas, now's the time when you can steam it up a little bit and see how nice and clean that gets everything. So the front portions of our neckline are looking good. It doesn't need a ton of work, but let's also give a nice little press to this back neckline portion. Okay. And lastly, we'll want to press the center front edges of our facing. So if I look at it from the side with the facing upwards, here's where we did our little understitching. Make sure you roll your seam right to the edge. The understitching will actually aid in this process, but get your seam right on the edge and then just give it a nice press up and down. So see how nice and sharp and crisp that made it? That's a combination of both the understitching and the pressing really doing its job. Same thing for the other side. Just giving a little press to the collar tips. There. Okay. So now that we've turned everything outwards and given it a nice press, we can admire our lovely work by positioning it right side out, and you can take that collar and fold it downward at its natural roll line. Now that our collar and facing are attached to our princess bodice, we'll be ready to sew and attach our A-line skirt next time.